You know that feeling when you wake up and something just feels off? That's exactly how I felt on July 25th, 1956. I was sleeping in my cabin aboard the most beautiful ship I'd ever seen, the Andrea Doria, Italy's pride, a floating palace of marble and art, cutting through the Atlantic like a knife through butter. In less than 3 hours, I'd be fighting for my life in the freezing ocean. My name is Margaret Sergio, and this is the story of how I survived one of the most dramatic shipwrecks in maritime history. But here's the thing that still haunts me to this day. It didn't have to happen. Let me take you back a bit, back to when this nightmare was still a dream. It was July 17th, 1956, when I first stepped onto the Andrea Doria in Genoa, Italy. I was 28 years old, traveling alone back to New York after visiting my family in Naples. My parents had emigrated to America when I was 5, but we still had relatives scattered across southern Italy. I'd saved for 2 years to afford this passage. The Andrea Doria wasn't just any ship. She was a symbol, a floating monument to Italy's recovery after World War II. When she launched in 1951, she represented hope, elegance, and the rebirth of a nation. And she was absolutely stunning. Picture this: 697 feet of streamlined beauty. Her hull was painted in the classic Italian ocean liner style, black below the waterline, white above, with a distinctive red, white, and green stripe along her side, the colors of the Italian flag. But it was what was inside that took your breath away. I remember walking through those corridors for the first time, my mouth literally hanging open. The walls were covered in art, murals, paintings, sculptures. Every public room was dedicated to a different Italian region or historical figure. The first-class ballroom had a massive mural by Salvatore Fiume. The dining rooms gleamed with Murano glass chandeliers. Even in tourist class, where I was staying, everything felt luxurious. My cabin was small, but comfortable. A bed, a desk, a porthole that looked out onto the endless blue of the Mediterranean. I'd sit there for hours, watching the water roll past, feeling like the luckiest girl in the world. The ship carried 1,134 passengers on this voyage, plus 572 crew members. That's 1,706 people total. Remember that number. It becomes important later. We had people from everywhere. Italian families returning to America, American tourists heading home from European vacations, businessmen, artists. A famous actress named Ruth Roman was traveling with her 3-year-old son. There was even a young couple on their honeymoon. Everyone had their own reason for being there. None of us knew we'd just bought tickets to one of the most famous maritime disasters of the century. The first few days were like something out of a movie. We stopped in Cannes, Naples, and Gibraltar. At each port, new passengers boarded, filling the ship with fresh energy and excitement. The weather was perfect. Warm Mediterranean sunshine, calm seas that barely rocked the massive vessel. I made friends quickly. There was something about being on a ship that made people open up. Maybe it was the shared experience. Maybe it was knowing we were all suspended between two worlds, not quite here, not quite there. I became close with a woman named Linda Morgan. She was 14 years old, traveling with her mother and stepfather. Bright kid, always asking questions, always curious about everything. I'd see her again, but not in the way you'd expect. The Andrea Doria had a reputation for excellence, and Captain Piero Calamai was determined to maintain it. He was 58 years old, a veteran of the sea with an impeccable record. He ran the ship with Italian precision and pride. Everything operated like clockwork. Meals were served exactly on time. The crew was professional and courteous. The engines hummed with a reassuring steadiness that you could feel through your feet when you walked the decks. By the time we entered the Atlantic, I'd fallen into a comfortable routine. Breakfast in the dining room, a walk on deck, reading in the library, lunch, maybe a nap. Dinner was always the highlight. Multiple courses, wine, conversation with table mates who became friends. The evenings were magical. The ship would light up like a floating city. The orchestra played in the ballroom. People danced, laughed, celebrated being alive. I remember thinking that this was what life should feel like: elegant, joyful, safe. We were making good time across the Atlantic. Captain Kalamai was pushing for an early arrival in New York. The Andrea Doria had a reputation for speed as well as luxury, and he wanted to maintain that reputation. By July 25th, we were in the final stretch. Just one more night at sea, and we'd be in New York Harbor the next morning. I was so excited I could barely sleep. I had no idea that most of us would never make it to New York aboard the Andrea Doria. July 25th, 1956, started like any other day at sea. I woke up around 8 in the morning, went to breakfast. The conversation at my table was all about arrival plans, who was picking people up, what they were most excited to see. The woman next to me was planning to surprise her daughter. She hadn't told her she was coming home early. The weather had changed, though. When I went up on deck after breakfast, I noticed the air felt different, heavier, cooler. The sun was still shining, but there was a haze on the horizon. By afternoon, the haze had become fog. Not thick fog, not yet. Just patches of it, drifting across the water like ghosts. The ship's horn started sounding at regular intervals, long, deep blasts that echoed across the water. Boom! Pause. Boom! It was eerie, but also kind of beautiful in its own way. I spent most of the day packing, organizing my things, making sure I had everything ready for our arrival the next morning. I remember carefully folding a dress I'd bought in Naples, blue silk with white flowers. I was planning to wear it when we arrived in New York. I never wore that dress. Dinner that evening was festive. The last night at sea always had a special energy to it. People were exchanging addresses, promising to stay in touch. The dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter. After dinner, I went back to my cabin. The fog had gotten thicker. When I looked out my porthole, I couldn't see much beyond about 50 feet. Just gray mist swirling in the ship's lights. The horn continued its melancholy song. Boom! I decided to turn in early. We were supposed to arrive in New York at 9 in the morning, and I wanted to be well rested. I changed into my nightgown, set my small travel clock, and climbed into bed. The last thing I remember thinking was how gentle the ship's motion felt. Just a slight rocking, like being in a cradle. I fell asleep around 10:30 p.m. At 11:10 p.m., my entire world exploded. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A tremendous, grinding crash that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The whole ship shuddered violently. I was thrown out of my bed, landing hard on the floor. For a few seconds, I had absolutely no idea what was happening. Was it an explosion? Had we hit something? Was it an earthquake? The ship listed immediately, tilted to the right, to starboard, in nautical terms. Everything in my cabin that wasn't bolted down started sliding across the floor. My suitcase, my shoes, books. The chair from my desk crashed into the wall. I tried to stand up, but the floor was at such an angle that I couldn't keep my balance. That's when I heard the screaming. Not just one person, dozens of people, hundreds of people, screaming in Italian, in English, in languages I didn't recognize. Panic has a universal sound. I grabbed onto my bed frame and pulled myself up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. The lights in my cabin flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Total darkness. The only light came from my porthole, where the ship's emergency lights were creating an eerie glow in the fog outside. I have to get out of here. That was the only thought in my head. Just get out. Get to the deck. Find out what's happening. I felt my way to where I thought my door was, my hands sliding along the tilted wall. The ship was groaning now, deep metallic sounds that vibrated through the walls. It sounded alive. It sounded like it was dying. I found my door handle and pulled. Nothing happened. The door was jammed. The impact had twisted the frame, and it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder. Panic was rising in my chest like water filling a tank. "Help!" I screamed. "Somebody help me!" I could hear people running in the corridor outside, footsteps pounding on metal floors, more screaming. Someone was crying, deep wrenching sobs that cut through the chaos. "The door!" I screamed again. "I'm trapped!" I pulled with everything I had. My shoulders slammed against the wood, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th try, something gave way and the door flew open. I tumbled out into the corridor, landing on my hands and knees. The scene outside my cabin was pure chaos. People were running in every direction, some in pajamas, some partially dressed, some completely naked. The corridor was tilted at such a sharp angle that people were literally falling down it, unable to keep their footing. Emergency lights cast everything in a dim red glow. A man ran past me, carrying a little girl who was screaming for her mother. An elderly woman sat against the wall, blood running down her face, looking confused and lost. A crew member was trying to direct people toward the stairs, but nobody was listening to him. Everyone was just trying to survive. I grabbed the railing along the wall and started pulling myself up the tilted corridor. Every few steps, someone would crash into me, or I'd slip and lose my footing. The ship was still groaning, still tilting further. We're sinking. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Oh God, we're sinking. I had to get to the lifeboats. Let me pause here and tell you what was actually happening, what I didn't know at the time. At 11:10 p.m., in thick fog off the coast of Nantucket, the Andrea Doria had collided with another ship, the Stockholm. The Stockholm was a Swedish ocean liner, much smaller than the Andrea Doria, but built with a reinforced bow for breaking through Baltic Sea ice. She was heading eastbound toward Europe while we were heading westbound toward New York. Both ships had each other on radar. Both ships knew there was another vessel out there in the fog. Both ships made decisions about how to pass each other safely. And both ships made the wrong decisions. I won't bore you with all the technical details. There'll be plenty of time for investigations and inquiries later. But here's what matters. The ships turned toward each other instead of away from each other. The Stockholm's ice-strengthened bow hit the Andrea Doria on the starboard side, about midship. The impact was catastrophic. The Stockholm's bow penetrated almost 30 feet into the Andrea Doria's hull, cutting through passenger cabins like a knife through paper. The force of the collision crushed several cabins completely, killing everyone inside instantly. 46 people died in the initial impact. Most of them never knew what hit them. The collision also ruptured the Andrea Doria's fuel tanks, causing thousands of gallons of oil to pour into the sea. Worse, it flooded several of the watertight compartments on the starboard side. The ship immediately began listing, tilting to starboard. And here's where the Andrea Doria's design became a death trap. She was built with a double hull for safety, with fuel tanks positioned between the inner and outer hull. It was supposed to make her unsinkable. But when those tanks were penetrated, they filled with seawater. The weight of all that water on one side caused the ship to list, and list severely. Within minutes, the Andrea Doria was tilting at 18 degrees. That might not sound like much, but try to picture it. Everything on one side of the ship was suddenly 18 degrees higher than the other side. Doors wouldn't close. People couldn't stand. Water started flowing across decks. And the lifeboats. This is the part that still makes me angry. Half the lifeboats became completely unusable. The Andrea Doria carried 16 lifeboats, 8 on each side. The ones on the port side, the high side, were now hanging so far inboard because of the list that they couldn't be lowered. The davits, the mechanical arms that lower the boats, couldn't swing them out over the tilted deck. We had just lost half our lifeboats. For 1,706 people, we now had only 8 lifeboats. Do the math. But I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew was that the ship was sinking, and I needed to get out. The stairway up to the boat deck was a nightmare. People were packed into it, all trying to climb up a staircase that was now at a crazy angle. It was like climbing a ladder, except with hundreds of panicked people pushing and shoving around you. A woman in front of me lost her grip and fell backward. I managed to catch her arm, and together with a man behind me, we pulled her back up. She never said thank you. She just kept climbing. There was no time for courtesy. Finally, I made it to the deck. The scene there was even worse than in the corridors. The fog was so thick you could barely see 20 feet. The deck was tilted so sharply that walking was almost impossible. People were sliding down toward the starboard side, grabbing onto railings, onto each other, onto anything they could reach. The ship's emergency lights were on, but they just made the fog glow in this sickly yellow way. It was like being inside a nightmare. Crew members were trying to launch the lifeboats on the port side, the high side, but it wasn't working. The boats were hanging at such an angle that they couldn't swing them out over the side. I watched as they tried again and again, the officers shouting at each other in Italian, desperation clear in their voices. On the starboard side, the low side, crew members were having better luck, but there were already hundreds of people crowded around those boats. I started making my way toward the starboard side, holding onto the railing with both hands. That's when I saw the Stockholm. She was maybe 200 feet away, emerging from the fog like a ghost. Her bow was completely crushed, twisted metal hanging down in jagged pieces. But she was floating. She wasn't listing like we were. She looked like salvation. People around me started shouting, pointing at her. Some people were crying with relief. The Stockholm could save us. She could take everyone aboard. But how were we going to get there? The gap between the ships was too wide to jump. The water between us looked black and cold, covered in a slick of fuel oil that reflected the emergency lights. Then I heard a new sound. Helicopters. Through the fog, I could hear the distinctive whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors. The Coast Guard had received our distress signal. They were coming. But would they get here in time? The Andrea Doria was settling lower in the water. I could feel it. The deck was tilting further with each passing minute. A crew member grabbed my arm. "Lifeboats!" he shouted in heavily accented English. "This way!" He pulled me toward one of the starboard boats that was being loaded. People were climbing in, some jumping from several feet above because of the severe list. The lifeboat was swinging wildly on its davits. A woman with a baby was trying to get in, and the crew member took the baby from her, literally tossing the infant to someone already in the boat. The woman screamed, then climbed in after her child. "You!" The crew member pointed at me. "Jump!" The lifeboat was a good 6 feet below the deck level and swinging away from the ship. If I mistimed the jump, I'd fall into the water. Or worse, I'd fall between the lifeboat and the ship and get crushed. I stood at the edge, frozen. "Jump!" he shouted again. I jumped. I landed hard in the lifeboat, crashing into someone who caught me. We were packed in like sardines, maybe 50 or 60 people in a boat designed for 30. Children were crying. A man near me was praying in Italian. An elderly woman kept asking for her husband, looking around with wild eyes. The crew members on deck were still loading people. Every few seconds, someone else would jump down into our boat, landing on top of those of us already inside. Then I heard the worst sound imaginable. A child screaming, not crying, screaming in pure terror. "My baby!" a woman shrieked from the deck above us. "Please, my baby is still inside." She was trying to go back into the ship. 2 crew members were physically restraining her. "No, go back!" one of them shouted. "Too dangerous! Ship is sinking!" "My baby!" she screamed again, fighting against them. I never found out what happened to her, whether she got back to her cabin, whether she found her child. The chaos was too complete. Our lifeboat started to lower. The davits creaked and groaned. We jerked downward a few feet, stopped, then dropped again. Every time we stopped, people would gasp, thinking the ropes had broken. The Andrea Doria's hull slid past us as we descended. I could see portholes, some dark, some still lit from inside. In one, I saw a face pressed against the glass. Someone still trapped inside, watching us descend. I looked away. We hit the water with a splash that sent spray over everyone in the boat. The crew members started working the ropes free from the davits above. "Row!" someone shouted. "Row away from the ship!" We had to get away from the Andrea Doria before she went down. If we were too close when she sank, the suction could pull us under with her. But most of the people in our boat didn't know how to row, including me. We had businessmen, housewives, children, not sailors. A few crew members and some of the male passengers grabbed the oars and started pulling. The boat moved slowly, agonizingly slowly, away from the dying ship. I looked back at the Andrea Doria. She was lower in the water now. The list was even more severe. It had to be at least 30 degrees. People were still on deck, still trying to get into lifeboats. I could hear their voices drifting across the water. The fog swirled around her like a shroud. In the distance, I could see the lights of the Stockholm. She was damaged, but she was stable. Lifeboats from both ships were heading toward her. Then I heard a new sound. Motor engines. More rescue ships were arriving. Over the next hour, the ocean around the Andrea Doria turned into a massive rescue operation. The first ship to arrive on scene, besides the Stockholm, was the Ile-de-France, a massive French ocean liner that had picked up our distress signal. She came through the fog like an angel, all her lights blazing. Captain Raoul de Baudian had turned his ship around the moment he heard we were in trouble. He ordered every light on the Ile-de-France turned on to create a beacon in the fog. The ship looked like a floating city, beautiful and warm and safe. Our lifeboat rowed toward her. The water was getting rough. The fog was still thick, but now the sea was choppy, waves slapping against our small boat. Several people were getting seasick, leaning over the side. The smell was terrible: seawater, vomit, and fuel oil. The oil was everywhere, coating the water in a thick slick that made the surface shimmer in the lights from the rescue ships. It took us nearly 45 minutes to reach the Ile-de-France. They had lowered rope ladders and cargo nets down the side of the ship. Getting people up was a slow, dangerous process. The elderly, the injured, children. Everyone had to climb. When it was my turn, I grabbed the rope ladder and started up. My arms were shaking. My hands were slick with oil. Every few feet I'd have to stop and rest, clinging to the rope, trying not to look down at the dark water below. Strong hands grabbed me at the top and pulled me over the railing. I was on the deck of the Ile-de-France. I was safe. I collapsed onto the deck and just sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. A woman, one of the Ile-de-France passengers, knelt beside me and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. "You're safe now," she said in French accented English. "You're safe." All around me, survivors were coming aboard. Some were being carried on stretchers. Some were walking but looked like zombies, blank-faced and shocked. Children were crying for parents. Parents were crying for children. The Ile-de-France's crew and passengers were amazing. They gave up their cabins for us. They brought food, clothes, blankets. The ship's doctor was treating the injured in a makeshift hospital in the dining room. I was given a cabin to share with 3 other women from the Andrea Doria. None of us spoke much. We just sat there, wrapped in blankets, trying to process what had happened. Around 2:30 a.m., one of the women went to the porthole and looked out. "Oh God," she whispered. We all rushed to look. The Andrea Doria was still there, maybe a mile away. But she was dying. The list was extreme now. She had to be at 45 degrees or more. Her starboard side was almost underwater. The lights were still on in some sections, creating this surreal glow in the fog. We watched in silence. At 10:09 a.m. on July 26, 1956, 11 hours after the collision, the Andrea Doria rolled over onto her side and sank. She disappeared beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. One moment she was there. The next, just empty ocean. I felt like I was watching a friend die. Here's something incredible that I didn't learn until later. Remember Linda Morgan, the 14-year-old girl I'd become friends with on the voyage? She was in cabin 52 on the upper deck when the collision happened. The Stockholm's bow hit the Andrea Doria right where cabin 52 was located. Linda should have died instantly. Instead, the impact literally threw her from her bed on the Andrea Doria onto the crushed bow of the Stockholm. When the Stockholm pulled away from the Andrea Doria, Linda was lying on the wreckage of the Stockholm's bow, unconscious but alive. A crew member found her there in the fog and wreckage. At first, they thought she was from the Stockholm. It took them hours to figure out that she had somehow been transferred from one ship to another by the force of the collision. Linda's mother and stepfather, who were in the same cabin, both died in the impact. Linda became known as the Miracle Girl. Her survival was physically impossible, yet it happened. She was one of 1,660 people who survived the sinking of the Andrea Doria. 46 people died, some in the initial collision, some who drowned while the ship was sinking, and some who died from injuries afterward. 46 lives lost because two ships made mistakes in the fog. The Ile-de-France brought us into New York Harbor on the afternoon of July 26th. I remember standing on deck as we approached the Statue of Liberty. Normally, arriving in New York is a moment of celebration. Ships blow their horns, people wave from the rails. We came in silently. The dock was packed with people, families waiting for loved ones, reporters, photographers. The flashbulbs were blinding. I had no one waiting for me. My parents had both passed away a few years earlier. I was supposed to be going to my small apartment in Brooklyn, starting back to work as a secretary the following Monday. Instead, I walked down the gangplank in borrowed clothes, with no luggage, no possessions except what I'd been wearing when I jumped into that lifeboat. The Red Cross had set up a station to help survivors. They gave me some money for immediate expenses, helped me get to Brooklyn. I unlocked my apartment door and just stood there for a while, looking at my furniture, my things, my normal life. It all seemed impossible, unreal. I was alive, but I didn't feel alive. I felt like a ghost. The inquiries into what happened went on for months. Both countries, Italy and Sweden, wanted to know who was at fault. The Andrea Doria's owners sued the Stockholm's owners. The Stockholm's owners sued back. Survivors filed lawsuits. It turned into a massive legal battle. Here's what the investigations revealed. Both ships knew there was another vessel out there. Both saw each other on radar. But they misinterpreted what they were seeing. They made assumptions about which direction the other ship was turning. The Andrea Doria's Captain Kalamai thought the Stockholm would pass port to port, left side to left side. The Stockholm's captain thought they would pass starboard to starboard, right side to right side. Both turned in ways that brought them together instead of apart. Add in the fog, the speed both ships were traveling, and the delayed reaction times, and you had a recipe for disaster. The case was eventually settled out of court. No one was ever officially found guilty. No captain lost his license. But Captain Kalamai never commanded another ship. He retired in disgrace, and according to reports, he was haunted by the sinking until his death. 46 people dead, a beautiful ship lost, millions of dollars in damages, and no one was held accountable. The nightmares started about a week after the sinking. I'd dream I was back in my cabin, hearing that terrible grinding crash, feeling the ship tilt. Sometimes I'd dream I was in the water, surrounded by darkness and oil. Sometimes I'd dream I was climbing that rope ladder up to the Ile-de-France, But every time I reached the top, I'd slip and fall. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat. This went on for months. I tried to go back to work, to resume my normal life, but everything felt wrong. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing, and suddenly I'd feel the floor tilt beneath me. My coworker would say something, and I'd hear the screaming from the corridor instead. I couldn't ride the subway. Too enclosed, too many people, too much like being trapped. I couldn't swim, couldn't even take a bath without panicking. I saw a doctor. He gave me pills to help me sleep. They helped a little, but they couldn't stop the memories. I started attending survivor meetings. There was a group of us who met once a month at a church in Manhattan. About 20 regular attendees, though dozens more came occasionally. We'd sit in a circle and talk about what we were going through. A man named Robert shared how he'd lost his wife in the sinking. She'd been in one of the cabins that the Stockholm's bow crushed. He said he kept setting a place for her at dinner before remembering she was gone. A woman named Catherine talked about how she couldn't stop washing her hands. The fuel oil, she said. She could still feel it on her skin even though it had been months. These meetings helped. Not because they made the trauma go away, but because they reminded me I wasn't alone in it. We had all survived the same nightmare. The Andrea Doria lies in 240 feet of water, about 60 miles south of Nantucket. She's become one of the most famous shipwrecks in the world. Divers call her the Mount Everest of diving because she's so deep and so dangerous. Over the years, several divers have died trying to explore her. The ship is deteriorating. The salt water is eating away at her hull. Eventually, she'll collapse completely. But for now, she's still there. Still sitting on the bottom of the ocean, tilted on her side, filled with the artifacts of 1,706 lives that were changed forever on one foggy night. Divers have recovered incredible things from the wreck. China from the dining room, artwork, jewelry, personal effects. In 1981, a diver recovered the ship's bell. It's now in a maritime museum. Every time I see photos of recovered items from the Andrea Doria, I wonder about my things. That blue silk dress I never got to wear. The gifts I'd bought for friends. The photos of my family I'd brought with me. All of it is down there somewhere. 240 feet below the surface. Part of me is still down there too. It took me years to come to terms with what happened. Years of nightmares. Years of avoiding anything that reminded me of that night. Years of feeling guilty for surviving when 46 people didn't. Survivor's guilt is real, and it's brutal. Why did I survive when the woman next door to me didn't? Why did I make it to a lifeboat when others didn't? What made me special? What made me deserve to live? The answer, of course, is that I didn't deserve it more than anyone else. Survival came down to location, timing, and luck. I was in a cabin that didn't get crushed by the Stockholm's bow. I was able to get my door open when others couldn't. I reached the deck when there were still lifeboats available. I jumped when the crew member told me to. Luck. Just dumb luck. But accepting that was hard. Part of me wanted there to be a reason, a purpose, some cosmic explanation for why I lived. Eventually, I realized that searching for that reason was pointless. There was no grand design, no destiny, just chaos and chance and one terrible mistake made in the fog. What I could control was what I did with the life I'd been given. In 1958, 2 years after the sinking, I met my husband, Thomas. He was a firefighter. We met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. I'd started going there every morning before work, and he'd be there after his night shifts. We started talking. Then we started having breakfast together. Then we started dating. I told him about the Andrea Doria on our third date. I'd been nervous about it. What if it scared him off? What if he thought I was damaged goods? He listened to the whole story. Then he told me about a building fire where he'd lost 2 fellow firefighters, how he still heard their voices sometimes, how he understood what it meant to survive something terrible. We got married in 1959. We had 2 children, a daughter in 1961 and a son in 1963. I never got on another ship. We took all our vacations by car or plane. Thomas never pushed me about it. He understood. But you know what's funny? I never stopped loving the ocean. We'd go to the beach every summer. I'd sit on the sand and watch the waves. And instead of feeling fear, I'd feel peace. The ocean hadn't tried to kill me. A ship had sunk. The ocean was just the ocean. I taught both my kids to swim. I wanted them to respect the water, but not fear it. In 1981, 25 years after the sinking, there was a survivors' reunion in New York. About 100 survivors showed up. Some I recognized immediately. Others I wouldn't have known if they hadn't been wearing name tags. We'd all gotten older, grayer, more wrinkled. But when we talked about that night, we were all 28 again, or 14, or 45. Whatever age we'd been when our lives changed forever. I saw Linda Morgan there, the miracle girl. She was 39 years old, married, with kids of her own. We hugged and cried. She told me she'd become a teacher. She said surviving the Andrea Doria had taught her that life is precious and short, and she wanted to spend hers helping young people. I met Robert, the man who'd lost his wife. He'd remarried. He had stepchildren. He said he'd never forgotten his first wife, but he'd learned to live with the grief instead of drowning in it. We shared our stories, our nightmares, our triumphs, the ways we'd learned to cope and move forward. Standing in that room, surrounded by people who understood exactly what I'd been through, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt whole. People ask me sometimes what I learned from surviving the Andrea Doria. Here's what I tell them. First, life is fragile. Incredibly, impossibly fragile. You can be sleeping peacefully one moment and fighting for your life the next. You can't control that. All you can control is how you respond. Second, human beings are capable of both incredible selfishness and incredible selflessness, sometimes within the same person. I saw people push children aside to get into lifeboats. I also saw people give up their spots to strangers. I saw crew members risk their lives to save passengers. I saw passengers help each other when they could barely help themselves. Crisis reveals who people really are. Third, trauma doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't go away just because time passes. You learn to live with it. You learn to function despite it. But it changes you fundamentally. I'm not the same person I was when I boarded the Andrea Doria in Genoa. That woman died in the Atlantic. I'm whoever emerged from the water afterward. Fourth, there's no glory in survival. It's not a badge of honor or a mark of worthiness. It's just luck. Pure, dumb luck. The real test isn't surviving the event. It's surviving the aftermath, the nightmares, the guilt, the memories that never quite fade. And finally, the most important lesson. Life goes on. The Andrea Doria sank. 46 people died. I survived. But the world kept turning. The sun came up the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. I had a choice. I could let that night define me, consume me, destroy me, or I could keep living. I chose to live. If you're watching this, you've just spent the last hour listening to me tell you about the worst night of my life. Thank you for that. Here's why I wanted to share this story. Not to sensationalize tragedy. Not to claim I'm some kind of hero. I'm not. I just got lucky. I share it because I want people to understand something important. Disasters happen. Ships sink. Planes crash. Buildings collapse. Lives change in an instant. You can't prevent every tragedy. You can't control the fog or the decisions that other people make. But you can control how you face uncertainty and fear. On the night of July 25, 1956, I could have frozen in my cabin. I could have given up when my door was jammed. I could have refused to jump into that lifeboat. But I didn't. I kept moving. I kept fighting. I kept choosing to survive. And afterward, when the nightmares came and the trauma threatened to overwhelm me, I kept choosing to live. Not just survive. Live. That's available to all of us, no matter what we've been through, no matter what tragedy has touched our lives. We can choose to keep living. I'm 95 years old now. Thomas passed away in 2009. I miss him every day. My daughter lives in New Jersey with her family. My son lives in California. I have 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. I live in a retirement community in Brooklyn, not far from where I lived when I first came to America as a child. I still have nightmares sometimes. Not as often as I used to, but they still come. I'll wake up hearing that grinding crash, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. But I also have good dreams. Dreams where I'm dancing in the Andrea Doria's ballroom. Dreams where I'm standing at the rail, watching the Mediterranean sun set over the water. The ship was beautiful. The voyage was beautiful. The ending was a tragedy. But that doesn't erase the beauty that came before. Last year, my granddaughter asked me if I regretted getting on the Andrea Doria. I thought about it for a long time before answering. No, I told her. I don't regret it. Yes, I survived a shipwreck. Yes, I carry trauma that will never fully heal. Yes, I lost things I can never get back. But I also experienced something incredible. I sailed on one of the most beautiful ships ever built. I crossed the Atlantic. I saw the stars from the middle of the ocean. And I learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined I could be. Would I do it again, knowing how it would end? I honestly don't know. But I know I wouldn't trade the life I've lived since that night for anything. The Andrea Doria has been on the ocean floor for 68 years now. In a few more decades, she'll likely collapse completely. The metal will give way. The beautiful murals and artwork will be lost forever. Eventually, there will be nothing left but a debris field on the seafloor. And eventually, all of us who survived that night will be gone too. The last survivor will pass away, and the Andrea Doria will transition from living memory to history. But I hope that when that happens, people don't just remember the tragedy. I hope they remember the rescue. The Ile-de-France, racing through the fog to help. The crew members who died helping passengers escape. The passengers who helped each other. The miracle of 1,660 people saved. I hope they remember that even in the worst circumstances, humanity shows through. And I hope they remember that survival isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new one. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Share it with someone who might benefit from hearing about resilience and survival. And if you've survived your own tragedy, whether it's a literal disaster or a personal crisis, I want you to know something. You're not alone. The nightmares might never completely go away. The trauma might always be with you, but so is your strength, your resilience, your ability to keep living despite what you've been through. That's not nothing. That's everything. I'm Margaret Sergio, and I survived the sinking of the Andrea Doria. But more importantly, I lived a full and beautiful life afterward. You can too. Keep living.